Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those on all of these occasions who join us on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house to make that courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It will be most appreciated. We, of course, will post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage website again for your future reference. Our internet viewers are always free to send questions during our programs or at any time for comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org, speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Stephen Bucci. Dr. Bucci is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. He is well versed in special operations, cybersecurity, as well as defense support to civilian authorities. He served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. Upon retirement from the Army, he remained at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. And immediately prior to joining us here at Heritage, he was a lead consultant to IBM on cybersecurity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Bucci. Steve?
Well, let me add my welcome to all of you that are here and watching from other places. Our subject today is the nation of Iran. I have been looking forward to this panel because I am not a subject matter expert in that area, but we have 3 gentlemen here who are. And I know enough about security issues and foreign policy and to say Iran is not a sideshow. It is a country of great concern. It is very competent. It is very aggressive. It is very assertive. And it has growing capabilities. So I think this meeting today will be of interest to all of you. It'll certainly be of interest to me. I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers here briefly and let you know that after I get done with that, I'm going to give each of them approximately 10 minutes to present opening remarks, and then we'll do Q&A. When we do the Q&A, I will moderate and will call on you. I would ask you if you have a question to identify yourself and then ask a question. This is something that has a question mark at the end of it. So I'll let you get about two and a half sentences. If I don't hear a question mark at that point, I'm going to ask you to sit down because this is not for speeches from the audience. For any of you who are really that excited and want to give a speech here, let me know and we'll set up a program and let you sit up here. But that's just seriously to be polite to all the other folks and so we can get as many questions in as possible. Okay, introductions. The first speaker this morning will be Jim Phillips. Jim is my colleague here at Heritage. He is our Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs. He has written extensively on Iran and the Middle East since 1979. Our colleagues were joking that Jim was here and we were talking about him here being the 1800s and that sort of thing, but Heritage wasn't quite here yet. He has also testified numerous times before Congress on issues related to Iran. He is a member of the Board of Editors for Middle East Quarterly, and prior to coming here was a research fellow at the Congressional Research Service and a former joint doctoral research fellow at the East-West Center. He'll be followed by Ken Katzman. Dr. Katzman is a specialist in Middle East affairs with the Congressional Research Service. He is the senior Middle East analyst for the U.S. Congress with special emphasis on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Persian Gulf states. He's written numerous articles and also a book entitled The Warriors of Islam, Iran's Revolutionary Guard. He has been an expert for several commissions on the missile defense threat to the United States, and prior to joining the Congressional Research Service was an analyst on Iran and the Persian Gulf states at the CIA, as well as being a defense consultant. And then lastly, we'll have Henry Sokolsky. Henry is the executive director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center, a Washington-based nonprofit that is designed to promote better understanding of strategic weapons proliferation issues. And he is also an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics. Henry's bio goes on and on. He's done a lot of research on nuclear proliferation and issues that many of us are concerned about with regard to Iran. And with that, I will stop and turn it over to Jim. And gentlemen, you can speak from your seat or from the podium, whichever you prefer.
Thanks, Steve. I think I'll just go from my seat here and just start off by saying that the election of Hassan Rouhani in Iran has raised hopes there as well as in the West that the Islamist regime will relax its repression of its own people and moderate its very hostile foreign policy. And in fact, the brief and highly orchestrated election campaign showed that within Iran there was a strong discontent with the regime's policies leading to economic pains, widespread discontent with the growing international isolation, and discontent with repression of political, economic, social, and religious freedoms. But the election alone will have little impact on the thrust of Iran's policies regarding the issues of most interest to Washington, and that's Iran's accelerating uranium enrichment program, its continued terrorism, growing intervention in Syria, and chronic human rights abuses. On these issues, the only vote in Iran that really counts is the supreme leader's, Ayatollah Khamenei. Under Iran's political system, the president has little latitude to make major policy changes on these issues, and I think this is commonly misunderstood in the West and in the media. Ayatollah Khamenei calls the shots, and that's why they call him the supreme leader or supreme guide. Although there's a facade of democracy in Iran, the real power lies within Iran's unelected religious establishment. Rouhani's elevation to power was more of a selection than a genuine election, because out of the almost 700 declared candidates, only 8 were approved, were selected to be able to run. The Guardian Council, which vetted the candidates, was sure to maintain that whoever is elected president will be a pliable servant of the supreme leader. And I don't think we should deceive ourselves on that. The authorities eliminated all candidates that had even the most remote connection to the Green Movement. Although Rouhani has been trumpeted as a reformer by some, this is largely based on some campaign rhetoric in which he promised to trim back the state repression and ease Iran's economic plight. But make no mistake, he is a consummate insider, a backroom operator, a longtime pillar of Iran's Islamist establishment. He's not a genuine reformer. If anything, he's not an Iranian Gorbachev, he's an Iranian Khrushchev. He may look good relative to President Ahmadinejad, just as Khrushchev benefited from comparisons to Stalin. But his differences with Ahmadinejad are more tactical than strategic, and he will bring more of a change of tone rather than disagreement on long-term goals. But hope in Washington springs eternal in the search for a grand bargain with an Iranian moderate, a so-called moderate. The Carter, Reagan, and Clinton administrations all bent over backwards to strike a deal with the so-called moderates. The Carter and Reagan administrations thought they had a deal at one point, but it quickly unraveled as soon as the Iranians or elements within the Iranian leadership decided it was in their interest to drop it. The Clinton administration wooed Iran's last great moderate hope, President Khatami, after he was elected in 1997, but found that he was unable or unwilling to transform his vague rhetoric into concrete changes in Iran's hostile foreign policy. So perennial American hopes to find the holy grail of an Iranian moderate that it can do business with and ignore the ideological context within which Iran's leaders operate. They see themselves as the vanguard of a global Islamist revolution and see Washington as the chief obstacle to that global revolution. They see us as the great Satan, And as Richard Weaver says, ideas have consequences, and as a consequence of this, there can be no genuine rapprochement with the U.S., which is impossible as long as Iran is ruled by this ideology. So what can be expected from President-elect Rouhani when he takes office next week? I think his election is more of a barometer of past shifts in Iranian public opinion on domestic policy issues, rather than a harbinger of future major shifts in Iranian foreign policy on important issues, which remain the bailiwick of the supreme leader. The election campaign focused mostly on the economy and very little on foreign policy issues. After several years of growing economic hardship and unrelenting repression, Iran's people have grown tired of revolutionary slogans and favor a more pragmatic approach to Iran's worsening problems. Rouhani took advantage of this by positioning himself as a centrist and defeated his rivals, which were dubbed by Iranian observers as the Seven Dwarfs, by positioning himself as and hinting that he would be the best candidate to lead Iran away from the tremendous police state that it has become. On foreign policy, he will bring a change of tone and present a less strident face to the world than Ahmadinejad did, but he's unlikely to bring major changes on the issues that the U.S. is most interested in unless he can convince the supreme leader to change his current policy, which will be a hard sell, I think. At his first news conference, he said he wants improved relations with the U.S., but he ruled out direct talks with Washington until it drops sanctions, respects Iran's nuclear rights, in quotes, and stops what he called interference in Iran's internal politics. This is not much of a departure from President Ahmadinejad. On the nuclear issue, he's no babe in the woods. He's been working in key national security positions for more than 30 years, including stints as the Secretary of Iran's National Security Council from 1989 to 2005, and he was Iran's nuclear negotiator from 2003 to 2005. And although he was very critical of Ahmadinejad's confrontational approach, he supported the 2006 decision to begin uranium enrichment. He remains firmly committed to Iran's nuclear program, and he's ruled out suspending uranium enrichment as called for by repeated UN Security Council resolutions. During the campaign, he boasted of deliberately deceiving Western diplomats in order to advance Iran's nuclear program while avoiding harsh sanctions. Given his past record of deception, he cannot be trusted as a negotiating partner. Unlike Ahmadinejad, he favors a quiet and calculating approach to pushing forward Iran's nuclear program, and he's likely to favor stringing out negotiations to buy time for further progress and to drive a wedge between the P5+1, the permanent 5 UN Security Council members, and Germany, who were Iran's diplomatic interlocutors on the nuclear issue. And for Washington, maintaining the unity of the P5+1 will be a high priority, but a very difficult task. And already we have news today that Russia's President Putin will be visiting Tehran next month to discuss the nuclear issue, among other issues. And he's sure to stake out an independent position that will undermine the solidarity of the P5+1. So what are the implications of Rouhani's rise for U.S. policy? I think first, the emergence of a new face at the top should not obscure the fact that the U.S. and Iran are on a collision course on the nuclear issue and Iran's support of terrorism. Second, given its past duplicity on the nuclear issue, the U.S. and its allies must take a principled position in the nuclear talks and insist on a verifiable halt to Iran's uranium enrichment program, the transfer of its stocks of medium enriched or 20% enriched uranium out of the country, the closure and dismantling of the uranium enrichment facility that Iran built at Fordow, deep underground in a hardened facility, and that Iran comes clean with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and allows unfettered inspections. I think third, engagement is not an end to itself. neither is a diplomatic agreement unless it verifiably precludes Iran from gaining a rapid nuclear breakout capability. Washington and the P5+1 should reject any agreement that does not immediately address the core proliferation issues, but only amounts to a short-term cosmetic deal that papers over these non-proliferation concerns with a diplomatic bandage. Fourth, the longer the nuclear impasse drags on, the closer Tehran gets to its goal of crossing the nuclear threshold. And to prevent Tehran from running out the clock, the U.S. must also establish that the diplomatic track is time-limited and must quickly produce results if a preventive military strike is to be avoided by the U.S. or by Israel in the future. Finally, given Iran's long track record of deception, sanctions should not be eased merely in exchange for Iranian promises. It would be a grave error to squander the leverage of sanctions merely for the promise of Iranian leaders that too frequently have gone back on their promises. They must take concrete and irreversible steps to halt their accumulation of enriched uranium and other programs. The bottom line is that I subscribe to the wise advice of the noted philosopher, Coach Bill Parcells. And he said, go by what you've seen, not what you've heard. And we've seen that President-elect Rouhani has been an important cog, a long-term cog in the Iranian Islamist machine that has repressed the Iranian people and exported terrorism and now seeks nuclear weapons. After he becomes president, we're sure to hear enticing words about mutual accommodation, detente, nuclear transparency, and reciprocal concessions. But what we need to see are concrete changes in Iran's behavior, not just empty promises. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Ken?
Thank you. I would say Rouhani campaigned on a platform of achieving an easing of international sanctions that have created high inflation and bankrupted many companies. He's going to need to show progress on this front relatively quickly. Otherwise, his support base is going to become restive and disappointed. Rouhani, I completely agree. He's been embedded within the system. He is not a different leader with a different view on how the Islamic Republic should be run. However, the people that voted for him and who achieved his election are indeed, many of them are the supporters of the Green Movement that rose up in 2009. There were, the seven dwarfs we've talked about, and Rouhani was very much a dark horse candidate, and he was able to tap this block of voters that initially were going to boycott the vote. But then when they saw that the regime was committed to a fairly free, in terms of absence of mass fraud, election, they came out and voted for him and put him over the top. These reformist voters, the young people, urban intelligentsia, the type of people that rose up in 2009, they basically feel that they own Rouhani, they own him, and they are going to press him very hard to live up to his promises. I predict they will be disappointed. Rouhani may try to implement these promises. The Supreme Leader will probably put a very sharp brake on this, and these voters will be disappointed. And at that point, we have the ingredients for perhaps another uprising or major unrest, I think. Nevertheless, the major question that has come up in international capitals since Rouhani's election is whether, and if so, how. And I want to address most of my talk today on the sanctions issues that are present. How to adjust. Should we adjust? Should the international sanctions regime be adjusted, and if so, how? Some countries, particularly those whose support for sanctions on Iran has already been grudging, Russia, China, for example, clearly seek an early easing of sanctions as an overture to Rouhani, as a way of welcoming his election. These countries and experts who support this point of view believe the international community should make an overture to Rouhani and to signal a new era of cooperation. According to this view, an easing of sanctions would represent a reward to the Iranian people for voting in the most moderate candidate who was in the race. He may not be a moderate in absolute terms, but relative to who else was running, he was the moderate. In the United States, many of the groups that have supported tough sanctions against Iran have taken a different tack. In their view, the Rouhani election represents a success for sanctions because the Iranian people have been so significantly affected by sanctions that they took risks to vote in a candidate who was promising to achieve an easing of sanctions, even the candidate the supreme leader clearly did not favor. Rouhani was probably the one that Ayatollah Khamenei least wanted to win, although he clearly accepted his election afterwards. According to this view, the sanctions are working, and increasing the sanctions would work even faster and more effectively. Those who take this view tend to downplay the notion that Rouhani's election will lead to any meaningful change in Iran's policies, and that putting a smiling face on the regime, much like Khatami was when he was elected in 1997, will only weaken international resolve to prevent a nuclear Iran. If there were to be a decision, whether in the short term or if Rouhani proves unable or unwilling to make compromises, for example, on the nuclear issue, if there were a decision to increase sanctions, the question then comes up, what additional sanctions would be effective in accomplishing the goals of the international community? Well, sanctions are already extremely comprehensive, having reduced Iran's oil exports by at least 50%, virtually shutting Iran out of the international banking system and barring Iran from receiving or repatriating any hard currency for its oil or other sales. There is, at this point, looking at the breadth of the sanctions regime, very little additional ground to plow that would affect Iran's strategic thinking other than sanctions that might completely shut Iran out of the oil export market entirely, and possibly shut its natural gas exports as well. Iran is still selling about 1.25 million barrels a day, primarily to only 5 customers now: China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Turkey. These countries have active exemptions under a 2011 law that prevents any payments for oil or other goods to Iran's central bank. The exemption or the exception is granted to those countries that significantly reduce their oil purchases from Iran every 6 months, and it's evaluated each 6 months. You have to keep cutting about 15% every 6 months to keep your exception, according to the consensus on implementation of the law, that law. One idea that gets talked about a bit in terms of, if there were a decision to have additional sanctions, is to eliminate this exemption entirely. In other words, requiring larger reductions to keep qualifying for the exemption, or requiring countries to get down to zero purchases of Iranian oil. This said, the others, those who oppose this idea, would say there could be severe consequences if oil buyers cut their purchases fast, dramatically, and there's not enough spare capacity on the market to supply these buyers. Other ideas that are out there include shutting down Iran's natural gas sector, as is being done with the oil sector. Iran is still a very minor exporter. In fact, some would say it's still a net importer of natural gas, and it does export natural gas mainly to Turkey and Armenia and places in the Caucasus. Georgia, I think, gets some indirectly, and others. However, this year, Iran and Pakistan finalized an agreement on a gas pipeline, a joint gas pipeline. And just 2 days ago, Iran and Iraq, the former enemies in the Iran-Iraq War, which I've spent much of my early career looking into, these two enemies just signed an agreement for Iran to export gas into Iraq through a to-be-constructed natural gas pipeline. None of these projects, the Pakistan project that I just mentioned, the Iraq gas line, none of these projects has been sanctioned yet under the Iran Sanctions Act. And that would be one step that, as an option, the administration could take. However, Iraq and Pakistan, which could be sanctioned under the Iran Sanctions Act, are necessary allies of the United States. Pakistan, the U.S. is depending on Pakistan to get all of our equipment out of Afghanistan and to help stabilize post-2014 Afghanistan. Iraq, obviously, we've spent, nearly $1 trillion trying to stabilize Iraq and help it rejoin the international community after Saddam Hussein, after the U.S. military took out Saddam Hussein's regime. So the United States is obviously very reluctant to sanction Iraq or Pakistan. The United States has sanctioned one Iraqi bank for transactions with Iran, but then withdrew. That sanction was ended a few months ago when this Iraqi bank pledged to stop doing these transactions with Iran. Some argue another option is to just simply expand the number of Iranian economic sectors for which doing business with those sectors would trigger U.S. sanctions. There are already several sectors, petrochemicals, oil sector, the ports, and industrial software, industrial processes. These sectors, if you do business with these sectors, you can be sanctioned. So one idea is to expand it, maybe include the mining sector, include the automotive sector, which an executive order just did that a few weeks ago, but legally with a new law perhaps to mandate sanctions if you deal with Iran's automobile industry. And they do have a sort of a nascent, they have an auto manufacturing sector there. However, the effect on Iran would likely be marginal, because many types of transactions with Iran are already banned. And also, U.S. sanctions on foreign firms doing business with Iran only affects Iran insofar as these foreign firms have business in the United States. Basically, the way the sanctions work is, if you, a foreign company, are doing business with Iran, then you're barred from doing business in the United States, or you're penalized from doing business in the United States. If you're a company that has no business in the United States, then any penalty will not affect you. So there is a flaw in how the sanctions, well, not a flaw, but it's not really a loophole, it's just a fact of life. The U.S. can only do so much. The U.S. cannot force Mrs. Merkel to penalize a German company. The U.S. cannot force Mr. Hollande to penalize a French company. All the U.S. can do is say, if those companies deal with Iran, they will be penalized from dealing with the United States. So, many Chinese companies, many companies of countries in the region, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Gulf states, Iraq, Afghanistan, they don't have any business in the United States. So any sanction is not going to affect them that much. So that's one issue. Just to play out the other side of the scenario, what steps would one put forward if one wanted to have an olive branch to Mr. Rouhani? Those who say we should reach out, maybe do an early easing of sanctions. What would one do? It's very difficult to speculate on, as I totally agree. There's a very deep hesitancy in the United States to make any advanced concessions to Iran until the U.S. sees what Rouhani wants to do and what he can do as far as satisfying U.S. national security requirements. What I expect is there might be an interregnum or a hiatus during which no new sanctions might be imposed until the outlines of Rouhani's policies become clear. And that will likely take us till at least, I would say, the end of this year, since he would not have a cabinet in place until probably around Labor Day or so. So just throw out that food for thought, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Henry, you bring it home.
First, let me say that there was one thing you didn't mention, which is in my resume. I was the first visiting scholar here.
Heritage, yeah.
So You can prosper from being associated with heritage. I'm proof. So any of you younger people should think about this. Second, outside, something for nothing. Party favors. There are two of them. I'm going to draw from one of them, and it's a piece by Greg Jones, who works for us, and he's done a really excellent analysis, technical analysis of the enrichment program. It was mentioned in The Economist, so it must be good. And then there is an occasional paper by someone who used to work at the National Labs, who knows more about the Iranian Bushehr power program than any of us, and explains how even this peaceful reactor became a proliferation portal. So you might take those on your way out, so we don't have to carry so many home. All right? So I'm going to talk to 4 questions today, and let me just run through them. I was asked to tell you where the Iranians are in their efforts to develop a bomb option. The short answer is closer than anyone may think, and I'll detail how much closer, after which I will address the next question, which is, what are the prospects for a deal? I characterize these as grim, which in turn should inform us with regard to the next issue, which is, what would a sound deal look like? A sound deal would look much tougher than what we are likely to get, and I fear far tougher than what we will bother to ask for, which then brings us to the last set of questions. What is the larger implications of all this for nuclear nonproliferation and the prospects of moving to zero future Irans? I think here, if we don't play our cards right, we will get more Irans, as if one wasn't enough. But there is reason to believe that if we promote a very tough deal and use this not just on Iran, but as a standard akin to the gold standard, which I'll talk a little bit about, that the United Arab Emirates and Taiwan have already accepted, we may be able to stop the nuclear proliferation hemorrhaging. Okay, let's get into where are they now. I am going to only talk about things that the IAEA has talked about. These are declared facilities that the Iranians admit they have, that we visited, we know exist. How shall I put it? It's bad enough just to talk about that. I mean, if you want to go further, there is some discussion of what the covert facilities might add to their weapons effort. I don't think, unfortunately, you need to go there to be in a very unhappy place already. So I'm just going to focus on what we know. First, I'm going to kind of inverse the order, because there's a tendency to talk about uranium, and I think plutonium doesn't get a fair shake. Yeah? It turns out there are 2 materials that you can use to make a bomb. One is separated plutonium, or plutonium that is not in spent fuel, which is, it's generated in a reactor, it resides in the spent fuel, you have to chemically extract it out from the spent fuel. But when you do, it's weapons usable, and there are various grades for this material. All of it can be used to make a bomb. Some of it is highly desirable in its performance characteristics. They call that weapons grade, but all of it is weapons usable. And then, of course, uranium, which has a, how many folks here took high school chemistry? Anybody? Oh, some hands. Okay. There's still hope. Isotopes. There's some nodding. Well, it turns out that with uranium, it comes in mostly a benign isotope. Almost 99.7% isn't really very useful for making bombs directly. But a very small portion is an isotope U-235 that is. And if you can up the amount of material that is that isotope, you can make a bomb. That's called enriching. It turns out Iran is interested in both of these materials, I think. And We've heard mostly about the uranium because they've really pushed that. But let's talk a little bit about the plutonium. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I always like talking about the weakest argument first. Yeah? Bouchier is a big power reactor. In fact, there's a picture of one. That's it, right there. We've heard a lot about it, and we're told not to worry about it. There was a very interesting thing that happened in mid-October, and a story that came out in December in the Wall Street Journal, though. It turns out that they shut down Bouchier, and they took all the fuel out. And then something very interesting happened. The CIA sent a whole bunch of drones to surveil the place. I wonder why. Well, it turns out in that fuel was approximately 100 kilograms of weapons usable, actually weapons grade plutonium. That would be enough for 25 bombs of a crude design, and if you had an advanced design, well, more. There weren't people from the IA to know whether or not the material was going to leave the building, and nobody knows for sure if they have a chemical stripping or reprocessing plant. Why? Well, you can build one of these inside of a warehouse. They don't have to be very big. Now, we have no reason to believe they have them, but then we have lots of reasons to wring our hands. And so they sent all these drones to make sure the fuel did not leave the building. Now, so when people talk about how peaceful the power reactor is and all that, keep that story in mind. By the way, it might interest you to know that they did this once before they took the fuel out, but they put it back in immediately. And this week, you guessed it, they shut down the reactor for safety reasons for a third time. Now, I don't know if they're going to remove the fuel or not, but watch that box. It's an exciting box, and it's one that can keep you fully employed if you work in an intelligence community. All right, they also have a heavy water reactor that they say will come online in 2014. There's reasons to be skeptical whether they can keep that schedule. Certain things are not clearly in their possession. Coolant pumps is one thing that people wonder whether they've mastered, whether they can build them. They've been trying to buy them. They haven't had much success. And there are issues with the fuel. But that will make 9 to 10 kilograms of weapons, again, grade material, in a year. So that's roughly, you divide by 4, you get sort of how many bombs worth. 2. Of course, the first one's always the most important. You know, once you get that first one, it changes your status, and then you can get more later. That brings us to the uranium. Now, there's been lots of discussion about how much highly enriched uranium they could have. They have not yet any. They have 123 kilograms by Mr. Jones's calculations, judging from everything that's been said in the IEA by the Iranians. That is of 20% enriched uranium. They have that on hand. Some of the material, they had more. They turned it into research reactor fuel. But they have 123 kilograms at 20%. Now, you could take that material and put it through an enrichment plant that they declared, and in about 8 weeks, you could have your first bomb's worth of material. Now, you could say, well, we'll notice. Well, no. This always is the thing that, no one in Washington ever wants to be surprised. It's sort of the, if the world blows up and you have a week's notice, you're all right. It's just when it happens and you didn't know about it that it becomes a problem, right? So the argument is, well, we'd have plenty of notice. Well, you might, but most people don't bother to read things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is 8 pages long or something. I mean, it's not very short. They talk a lot about it. They don't read it. If you read it, and if you read the IAEA statute, the International Atomic Energy Agency statutes, and the safeguards agreements, which are not that hard or difficult to read, you quickly discover that Iran can simply announce that it's making highly enriched uranium and give 1 day's notice. Perfectly legal. By the way, they even have an explanation. Well, we need highly enriched uranium because we're thinking about making naval reactors. Now, okay, it's a little wacky. I realize this is a bit of a stretch, but the number of times we've been slowly surprised by Iran is more than what you have on one hand. It's probably 10 times or more. I've been tracking this since I worked in the Pentagon on these matters since 1989. So there are a lot of things that weren't supposed to happen that have happened. This could. Now, it turns out that the next thing that people say, oh, well, but they wouldn't know how to make a bomb. I think that's not right. I think that's not right for a number of reasons. First of all, you could make a gun device with 20 kilograms. It would have a yield of about 2 to 4 kilotons. And we didn't even bother to test such a device ourselves. I think it's not beyond their ability to design. They also likely have developed an implosion device already. I mean, this would take, 2 to 6 months to do, but why they would wait until the last moment to do it? No country has ever done that. They've always done parallel development. And we have some people whose authority, I don't know how much you want to weigh it, but Ali Honenin, who I respect, who was the deputy director at the IA for safeguards and spent a lot of time in Iran, says, well, they can produce a bomb in about 1 or 2 months. And then he goes on to say, in less time than we could respond militarily or diplomatically. And that's now. Now that has some implications for answering the second question, which is, what are the prospects of cutting a deal? Now, I don't know what the prospects ever were. If I talk to people who speak Farsi, they say, well, it never was in the cards. Culturally, these folks don't want to agree with anything on this. I don't know if that's true, but I don't know because I don't speak Farsi. I would at least say it this way. Whatever the interest was in cutting a deal before, it's a lot less now. And the reason why is because before they didn't really master a weapons option. I think they've mastered the weapons option. It's a matter of making a decision now. It's not, well, they're missing something. And because of that, I think they're not going to want to actually cut a deal of any substance. They may be interested in continuing negotiations, as Jim and Mr. Katzman has pointed out. I think they understand that it's in their interest to continue to insist on 3 points. 1, they must have the right to enrich. And 2, if they give up any material, they can't give up anything that's low enriched uranium, that's 5% or less. They can make concessions on material above that. Now, why? Well, because they know that if they just bring online the centrifuges they've already installed at Natanz, they will have enough centrifuge capacity to take the low enriched uranium and in 8 weeks have a bomb. As long as they have a right to operate the centrifuges, as long as they can do low enriched uranium, they're in a very happy place for a bomb option, even if they surrender the 20% material. A lot of people don't get that. So they're very keen on rights. By the way, I've become very unpopular in Washington saying, there are intellectual arguments for why countries may not have the right to make nuclear fuel under the NPT. I'm told this is just very incorrect thinking. In any case, I think Western leaders need to be careful, not to get rolled. I think more likely than not, there's going to be a long kabuki of negotiation so that everyone can run the clock out. The Iranians can get even closer to a bomb, and no one can be blamed for having either started a war or having let them get the bomb. So you just keep talking. I think that may be the most likely thing. So what would a sound deal look like? No nuclear fuel making, your point, but not just enrichment, chemical separation of plutonium. You have to allow wide area inspections to try to find covert facilities. You need to connect the cameras that are in various places to monitors in Vienna and be able to give an image every 5 minutes. As it is, they don't give any image for 3 months, and that's too long. So you want near real-time surveillance, and you need, I think, on-site inspectors at these facilities, 24/7. Now, here's the catch. I don't think you should insist on this just for Iran. I would argue, hey, let them be the model for the world. By the way, the nuclear industry hates this, which makes me think I'm onto something. They are too eager to do exports, in my opinion. Too eager. And they need to be pulled back. And in that regard, I think if you did a firm deal, you'd have a way, whether Iran follows or not, and I suspect they wouldn't, of at least talking to the others so that they don't follow. And in this regard, we are really at an interesting moment, and this is my last point. Right now, we're telling the South Koreans not to make nuclear fuel. We're sending delegations to Vietnam to try to sell them reactors with no conditions on making nuclear fuel. The industry is sending letters to Kerry and to Moniz saying, forget trying to insist on no nuclear fuel making conditions. When you go to Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Korea, Jordan, we are encouraging the Japanese, for some reason, to make more nuclear fuel. There is something about this that reminds me of Lincoln's speeches about the House divided. This cannot stand. At some point, things are either going to fall apart in one direction or the other. I think it's important what we do with regard to Iran to make sure it falls in the tougher direction. With that, I conclude.
Okay, thank you. All right. I'm going to stand up so I can see everybody. All right, we have our microphone people getting in place. I'm going to ask the first question, and strangely enough, it's not going to be about nukes, because I have a different area of interest, so I'm going to drag you into it. Iran, we think, or allegedly, was behind the cyber attack on Saudi Aramco here about a year ago. What do you gentlemen make of that? What was it, a signal? Do you think that was as far as they could go? I know none of you, at least to my knowledge, are cyber experts, but look at it from the standpoint of Iranian experts. What do you think it meant?
Let me just start off. I don't know the technical aspects, but politically, there's a raging Cold War, Islamist Cold War going on between Saudi Arabia, which sees itself as an exemplar of Sunni Islamism, and Iran, which is the vanguard of Shia and pretensions for all Islam. And these growing tensions have been reflected not only in this attack, but in the Iranian plot against the Saudi ambassador in Washington, which no one seems to talk about anymore. But if it had been put into operation, would have killed Americans in a Washington restaurant, perhaps senators, who knows. But this cyber attack, I think, is a signal not only to the Saudis but to the U.S. and the world community that if the balloon goes up in terms of a military conflict with Iran, that Iran has options for closing down oil exports. It's kind of a counterpart to its constant drone of threats on the Strait of Hormuz to drive up oil prices and in part to weaken sanctions on it that way. But that's my 2 cents. I don't know if anyone else has.
I would also say there might have been an element of Iran got hit with the Stuxnet virus several years ago, 2010, I guess it was, and about 1,000 centrifuges were shut down. So I think Iran is trying to show they have a countervailing capability, try to deter cyber attacks. So I think that was an ingredient of what explained that.
Okay. Other questions? Right down here in the front, sir.
Hi, thank you for doing this. My name is Emin Barouda with Al Mayadeen TV. We've heard maybe your recommendations to the U.S. administration in, like what should be done. But how is the political establishment, is it divided towards Iran and what to do about it, or does it present a unified view?
By the way, the answer to the first question, yes. It is divided.
I would say maybe the executive branch, maybe internal differences, but I think Iran is one of the few unifying issues on Congress, in Congress, that it provides built-in bipartisan majorities on the need to get tougher on the nuclear program and sanctions. So, at least in Congress, I don't think there's as much division as perhaps within the
Okay, well,
executive.
let me qualify, because he's right too. Yeah, it's about the war thing. That's where everybody, Republican, Democratic, legislative, executive, is not clear. Sanctions, hey, terrific. I mean, I got an option other than that? Oh, yeah, sign me up.
But the administration?
Boy, I have this image of a large bag of quarters, being flipped. I mean, they must be reading the polls very carefully. I think the problem you have now with this executive is he's embattled, and to be honest, he's worried about looking weak. That's not great. So it could cut a lot of different ways.
Ken?
I would just add, I think there is a consensus in there has been a consensus in the administration to pursue the P5+1 negotiations with Iran. The difference is, at what point do you say that's obviously not going anywhere, cut it off, and then pursue other options? There's differences. Some want to keep it going, and don't want to cut it off at any point and think, continue investing resources in it. And others, I think, are starting to think, that this is just not going to ever get anywhere, and let's move to Plan B or whatever it is.
Normally to be when you're ready for something else.
Say again?
I mean, the time when you're ready to do something else would be the time where you say that's enough.
And the something else would be military action, you're saying? Well, I don't,
Once they have it.
I think there's always a readiness for that. I don't think that's overly complex. We can get into that at a different.
The alternative makes no.
Yeah. I think, part of the problem is, the last several presidents have been serviced by some of the finest political science pollsters in history, and they listen to them. And so that makes it very hard to read what's going to happen.
Okay, other questions? Come on, somebody's got another question. Right there?
There you go.
Okay.
Would, assuming they have the bomb, what would Iran do? Would they use it as blackmail? Do they have a plan? Are they going to threaten? Are they going to do a mouse that board type of a scenario, create a scenario like that? What kind of visions are out there that?
First of all, I mean, everyone on this panel probably has a different view. I wish I read Farsi. That might help. I'm not sure they would write it up and send me a note saying, okay, here's what we're up to. I think one of the reasons it's such a great topic to talk about is the uncertainty about this. My own view is that some of the rhetoric about what they might do, they'd immediately hand it off to terrorists, they would immediately fire something. That doesn't sound right to me, but, other people, are more I won't say excitable, sensitive than I am on this. But it's the uncertainty about that that certainly causes people to come to gatherings like this. number one. And number two, I'm reminded of a comment by someone who I recently died, Frederick Clay. He always talked about casting diplomatic shadows. Well, this one would probably accord with the range arc of the delivery system, their missiles. It changes lots of things without use or even declaration of possession. And so there's lots of subtlety. And then you do have to worry that a lot of folks never settle for just having something in potentia. They like developing it and showing it off. And so when might that happen? We don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty grim scenario, even if you assume that Iran would not use a nuclear weapon itself in a first strike, would not pass it off in some kind of plausible, deniable fashion to a surrogate terrorist group. That even if you make the best case assumption that it would act in a very responsible, restrained manner, I think there's a danger that it could see a nuclear capabilities carte blanche to step up. It's already massive support for terrorism around the world. If they would take the risk to pull this terrorist operation off in Washington before they get a bomb, what are they going to do after a bomb? And then even if they don't make some immediate move against Israel or some other U.S. ally or against the U.S. itself, just the fact that they have one will prompt other countries in the Middle East to get their own. And, it won't be too long to the Saudis either rent one or buy one from Pakistan, or Turkey's not going to sit there and have to swallow a lot of their military pride when Iran's got a nuclear weapon. So you could very quickly develop a cascade of nuclear proliferation on a multipolar hair trigger basis that, would be extremely unstable for the Middle East, which already is one of the most volatile regions in the world. So even if you make the best case assumptions about Iran, it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to add to that, separate from the cascades, you two are experts, I'm not, but I got the impression in my one visit to the region that they have a very keen sense, the Iranians, of pride, and they like the idea of tribute. The neighbors really are not as good as they are. They don't have the same history. They're not quite as good. And that they ought to kind of come to Papa. That alone is a problem. The neighbors don't like that. But it has consequences if you start behaving that way. And I think this reinforces that instinct, I suspect. That's speculation. I really don't know what I'm talking about here. But
No,
you
you
two
do.
can confirm or deny.
You actually do know because I think a nuclear Iran is likely to demand, and they've demanded even before having a nuclear weapon, that the Gulf states stop allowing their bases and facilities to be used by the United States military. They've repeatedly requested that. Obviously, the Gulf states have told them, because they're under a U.S. security umbrella, take a hike. Obviously have not responded to that demand. But a nuclear Iran would have somewhat more authority to make that demand, and that's the danger, that the Gulf states would indeed perhaps start canceling our defense cooperation agreements
They
that
might
we
offer.
use.
They might offer to provide for their security instead of us.
Just, I want to throw one out. Henry, you very eloquently described the scientific sophistication part of this thing. But I'd ask Jim and Ken if you guys could talk a little bit. Most Americans look at Iran, and the vision that pops into our head is either Mr. Ahmadinejad, who is kind of clownish, or some of the clerics who we don't really understand and we see as odd with funny clothes and things. Can you talk a little bit about the cultural sophistication and kind of views of Iran as a nation? Because I think that's something a lot of Americans don't really get.
Well, just to start, even in the current regime, a lot of them studied, in the United States. I get into this discussion with diplomats, that, we have to look at Iran, holistically. I compare it often with North Korea. With North Korea, the United States was never allied with North Korea. We had a war, and we've been at odds with them the whole time. We were allies with Iran at one point, and there's a lot of reminiscence about that in Iran, even some in the current regime, and here. So Iran is viewed by some as redeemable, and we should look at their side of the view. They are very sophisticated. They understand the United States. They're obsessed with the United States. They're obsessed with American power. I believe Ayatollah Khamenei is inexorably committed to avoiding any war with the United States on Iranian soil. He might go to war with us by proxy in Syria or elsewhere. He has no problem with that. But when it comes to provoking the American military to come and attack on Iranian soil, he will absolutely he runs the other way. He does not want that. He was president, We had a naval battle in 1988, April. In 3 hours, the U.S. Navy destroyed 30% of their ships in 3 hours. I mean, he remembers this. He was president at the time. So, I think there's that aspect. I'm not sure I'm answering your question necessarily.
No, that's exactly. Jim, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, I respect Iranian civilization, its culture. It's a very vibrant culture, and Iranians are very well educated. I think they would be suited for a democratic system, because even in this little truncated system, that they've shown a thirst to get out of it. And unlike some other countries in the Middle East, there's more tolerance for differences of opinion within the rigid authoritarian lines. There's a very wide difference of opinion. They're articulated in a huge amount of media, although they've really cracked down on that since Ahmadinejad came to power. And one of the things that worries me is that, I actually welcomed Ahmadinejad's election, because I think he helped wake up the rest of the world about what was going on, especially on the nuclear side, because he kind of trumpeted these achievements as, the flowering of Iranian scientific culture, and he put, nuclear technology on Iranian dollar bills, and he's playing into national pride and their very extensive scientific accomplishments, and trying to mask the nuclear program within this civilian this nuclear weapons program within a civilian power program that all Iranians are proud of. But one of the things that concerns me about the new Iranian leader is if it falls back on the pattern of previous President Khatami, that smiling and saying some nice diplomatic words may dull the perspectives in the West, at least in the public opinion, about the long-term threat posed by Iran. And I think that, despite Iran's very attractive culture, we need to bear in mind that this is an Islamist totalitarian state, and that, I think, runs very counter to that culture, in the long run will pass into the dustbin of history. But in the short run, there's a lot of reason to be worried.
Again, a super amateurish cut. First, I remember when I was first asked to do an unclassified study of their ability to make complex missile and nuclear systems back in 93, and it wasn't there. They had 12,000 folks as defense contractors at the time, making, I guess, one bullet each. I don't know how they function. They got over that. They make their own cars, and as a car buff, I know that's kind of complicated. They make cars. It was pointed out to me by someone who's Iranian that they are a serious country because they have mountains and some of their neighbors don't. they have history. You know, they've been a country a long time, they got literature, they actually make movies that are interesting. I mean, you can't say that about everybody else around. And so, whatever the people are who are running this place, it is a place, and it can be run, and that's part of the problem. It's a serious country. And I think people, you know, shouldn't kid themselves on that point.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
get the microphone there, sir.
From what I hear, the panel agrees, I think, that there will not be a meaningful or fruitful negotiations. If that's the case, then do you think would it be wise for the administration to invest in oppositions who will openly accept NPT and the inspection regime?
Yeah, I think I think the Obama administration made a huge blunder by turning a blind eye to events in Iran after the stolen elections in 2009, which sent a signal that it was more interested in reaching a deal over the head of the Iranian people with the regime, and gave, you know, kind of minimal lip service to the struggle for freedom in Iran. And I think in the long run, that's the greatest hope. But you know, the administration and Washington, well, the West in general, has to be very careful how it you know, poses this support. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to support specific groups, not only because the regime, that would strengthen their propaganda about the U.S. intervention in their affairs, which has, you know, may at one time and it continues to have resonance within Iran, but you know, to anoint a group or to be seen as supporting a group could undercut that opposition group within Iran. So I'd be very careful about that.
Yeah, I would say also that, you know, as I said, the people that put Rouhani over the top in the election are the people that basically got out in the streets in 2009. They're going to immediately demand. One marker is, does he achieve the release of Mir Hussein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, who were the leaders of the 2009 uprising? Clearly, you know, there is an expectation that he will achieve that. And there are thousands of political prisoners that have been put in since the 2009 uprising. And if he doesn't do it, there's going to be a schism. There's going to be demands. Why you have not done this? We voted for you. You know, you insinuated you would help us, and so where is it? And I think the U.S. can sort of play on that. You know, that holding Rouhani to his promises, holding to the expectations. But, you know, undertaking covert options in favor of clandestine armed groups, I think, is a strategy that I don't see a lot of support around town for at this point.
Okay, I'm going to exercise the moderator's option here, because I'm going to ask the three of you, I'm going to give you 2 minutes each, and I want you to tell me and tell our audience, where is the relationship going between the U.S. and Iran in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, let me just start off. I think President-elect Rouhani will make some symbolic diplomatic gestures, just as I think he will on the domestic front. He needs to, you know, have some results to appease some of his supporters who may see in him, you know, hope for change that, you know, is enough to get him elected, but maybe he can't deliver on. And I think he'll make a major show of trying to make some kind of diplomatic action at the P5+1 talks, but I don't think this action will amount to much movement, and I don't think it'll be enough to give substance to hopes of some kind of a grand bargain or diplomatic deal. I think we'll be in a holding pattern in which superficially it seems relations are better, but behind the scenes, the uranium enrichment that continues to progress, not to mention all these new things I have to worry about from Henry. Yeah. But, I think he'll be a useful front man in distracting the West from a problem that is becoming greater and greater and festering, and may try to prolong hopes for some kind of diplomatic solution, which I don't see is in the cards. So I still see Iran and the U.S. as on a collision course, but when that collision is going to come, I couldn't say.
Yeah, I think basically we're in for several more years that look like the last several years. When 2013 started, there was a spate of articles saying 2013 is the year of decision, and it's either going to be military conflict or resolution, and we're past the middle of 2013 and not even close to that. So I think 2014 more of the same, because the basic structure of the situation hasn't changed. The U.S. does not want to engage in another conflict, and Iran does not want to provoke another conflict. That basic structure is intact, and I don't see it necessarily changing. Iran has continued to enrich, but then you see them, as Henry said, they take a little of the 20% and they make oxide powder, which can't be used. They show that they're not really wanting to push this thing to the boiling point, and I don't see that changing. Even whether there's a deal that's achieved in the P5+1 or not, I think that basic structure continues for several more years, I think.
I guess my only, by the way, the short answer is, I don't know. It's always useful to kind of make that up front. But having said that, I mean, something might change a little with our relations, and it probably won't be about these nuclear things. I mean, if we're lucky. I mean, they're not going to test or do something wild. It's Syria. Watch that box. That could perhaps change how friendly or unfriendly we view anyone in Iran who is in the government. So it's not a what would you call it, a bull market. It looks, I like your assessment. I'll go with that. Okay.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panel. They've given us a great deal to think about. Not a lot to be happy about, mind you guys, but a lot to think about on this very important issue. Thank you for being here this afternoon, and join us out in the lobby. Thank you very much.